Welcome forward here. I'd like to welcome you to another pamphleteer by Dale Carnegie, titled How to Make Our Listeners Like Us. This publication is from 1962. How to Make Our Listeners Like Us by Dale Carnegie. One of our biggest problems as speakers will be to make our listeners like us in order to win our sympathetic hearing or our messages. Here are 12 tested rules for winning listeners and influencing audiences. 1. If we feel that we are honored by being asked to address an audience, let's say so. 19 days after Pearl Harbor, Winston Churchill addressed both houses of the United States Congress. He began by expressing his appreciation in the strongest words possible. Quote, "I feel greatly honored," end quote, he began. Quote, "that you should have thus invited me to enter the United States Senate chamber and address the representatives of both branches of Congress. The fact that my American forebears have, for so many generations, played their part in the life of the United States, and that here I am, an Englishman, welcomed in your midst, makes this experience one of the most moving and thrilling in my life. I wish indeed that my mother, whose memory I cherish across the veil of years, could have been here to see me. By the way, I cannot help reflecting that if my father had been American and my mother British, instead of the other way around, I might have gotten here on my own." End of quote. Former Governor Thomas E. Dewey of New York won friends by opening his address before the Herald Tribune Forum with the words, quote, "I consider it an honor to be the closing speaker at this forum, which was opened by one of the most distinguished Americans in our time, Mr. Bernard Baruch." End of quote. Irving S. Cobb certainly knew how to make the Irish like him and overwhelm him with applause. Cobb began his address before the American Irish Historical Society with the heartwarming words, quote, "Mr. President, and ladies and gentlemen, I am speaking but the plain truth when I tell you I would rather be here tonight facing an assemblage of men and women of Irish blood and Irish breeding than to be in any other banquet hall on the earth. For I am one who is Irish and didn't know it, but now I do know it. I am prouder of that fact than any other thing on the earth except that I am an American citizen." End of quote. Let me make this clear. Churchill, Dewey, and Cobb weren't merely mouthing polite words. They meant what they said. They were honored by being invited to make those addresses. As a matter of fact, it is almost always a compliment to be asked to speak before any group, no matter how small and unimportant the group might be. It is a matter of courtesy and good manners to acknowledge such a compliment. That is one way to make an audience like us. Rule 2. Let's give our listeners sincere appreciation. Chauncey M. Depew, railroad president, former U.S. state senator, and one of the most popular speakers in America ever produced, declared that the best way to make his listeners like us is to tell them some complimentary fact about themselves that they didn't think we could possibly know. I knew a speaker who was a master at that sort of thing, the late Russell H. Cornwell. the founder of the Temple University, and probably the most famous lecturer of modern times. He delivered one lecture, quote, "Acres of Diamonds," end quote, over 6,000 times. That is equal to delivering it every night in the year for more than 16 years, a record never achieved before in the history of mankind. He told me how he varied his famous talks from night to night and tailored it to fit the audience. As soon as he arrived in a town where he was to lecture that night, he spent hours interviewing local men and women, learning about their histories, their accomplishments. And during the course of his lecture that night, he made references to these local men and women who found, quote unquote, acres of diamonds in their own backyards. Dr. Conwell won the hearts of his listeners each night by giving them sincere appreciation of their accomplishments. That is what my friend Jennings Randolph did when he addressed the luncheon meeting at the Alpha Lota, a businesswoman's sorority in Washington, D.C. My wife attended that meeting and told me about it. Jennings Randolph is an extremely busy man. He was an assistant to the president of a major airline and former congressman from West Virginia. He is in great demand as a speaker. His schedule is crowded, but busy as he is, Mr. Randolph took the time to find out something about his woman's organization before he appeared as the speaker. He began his talk by expressing his pleasure at being there. Then he mentioned certain things he knew about the sorority that were very much to its credit. He repeated complimentary remarks he had heard about it from businessmen. That audience was charmed by Mr. Randolph's sincere appreciation of their organization. They loved him for taking the pains to find out something about them in order to pay them a gracious compliment and do it sincerely. Naturally, his talk was a thundering success. He was speaking to a group of warm friends, and he had made them his friends in 2 minutes by giving them honest appreciation. Mr. Randolph made a fine talk that day, but he had to do it so completely won the regard of his listeners beforehand that I believe they would have given him courteous attention if he had merely read aloud from a telephone directory. Contrast him with the speaker who goes before a group to speak without knowing or caring whether he is addressing the Kiwans or the wholesale grocer associations or any kind of audience, are as quick to respond to courtesy as are individuals, and they are just as quickly to resent discourtesy. Just as individuals will forgive us many small faults if they like us, audiences will forgive us for minor faults of delivery if they like us. Being warmly appreciative of them is one way to make them like us. So let's remember, never speak before any group without finding as much as we can about that group beforehand, whether it is a dog catchers union or the National Association of Manufacturers. Then let's spend a few seconds reminding the audience of some of its fine or unusual qualities that makes us proud to be chosen as its speaker. Rule 3. Whenever possible, let's mention the names of some of our listeners. One day a few years ago, I taught a class in the Sattler Hotel in New York City. A speaker, in his attempt to use Rule 3, mentioned the name of everyone in his class. The result was almost as disastrous as he attempted to eat all of the apple pie the Stradler Hotel had on hand that day. Rule 3, when used with moderation, is excellent. Please notice how effectively Winston Churchill mentioned the names of very few, of his listeners in his 20-minute address before the mid-20th century or the mid-century convocation of the Massachusetts Institution of Technology. Quote, "How right you are, Dr. Compton." Quote, "Dr. Bouchard and the Dean of Humanities spoke with awe." Quote, "Mr. Bevan, who has come here to sign the Atlantic Pact." End of quote. And so on. A man's name is to him the sweetest sound in any language. So, whenever possible, mention the names of some of your audience. Rule 4. Let's play ourselves down, not up. Modesty usually inspires confidence and goodwill. For example, Winston Churchill made his visible audience and millions of radio listeners love him when he opened his address before the mid-century convocation of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with these words, quote, "I frankly confess that I feel somewhat overawed in addressing this vast scientific and learned audience on the subject which your panels are discussing. I have no technical and no university education, and I have just had to pick up a few things as I went along. Therefore, I speak with diffidence, which I hope to overcome as I proceed, on these profound scientific, social, and philosophical issues, each of which claims a lifelong study for itself." End of quote. When Winston Churchill confessed that he had, quote, "just had to pick up a few things as he went along," end of quote, his audience broke into a delighted roar of appreciation. The contrast between Mr. Churchill's eminent accomplishments and the modest statement was funny. The whole world knows that Winston Churchill was one of the few immortals of his generation, and we loved him because he played himself down. Audiences also like the way Percy H. Whiting told about the way he became a sales manager. The fact is that Mr. Whiting was a successful sales manager for various firms for 19 years. He had made enough money as a sales manager to go into business for himself on Wall Street. Did he present himself to an audience that way? No, sir. This is what Mr. Whiting told his audience about himself, and they loved it. Quote, "I was hired to sell the stock of the Central Maine Power Company in Augustus, Maine." End of quote. He said, quote, "I worked hard for 2 weeks and sold only 7 shares. Then the boss said, 'Percy, it is perfectly obvious that you are worthless as a salesman, so I'm going to raise your salary and make you a sales manager.'" End of quote. When it came to poking good-natured fun at himself, Abraham Lincoln was an artist. For example, when he was running for the state legislature in 1840, his opponent, Colonel Dick Taylor, denounced Lincoln as an aristocrat because he had married into an aristocratic Todd family, and being known as an aristocrat during those rough days of the frontier life was almost sure to mean political defeat. So Lincoln answered the charge by saying, quote, "While Colonel Taylor was riding in fine carriages and wearing ruffled shirts and kid gloves, I was a poor boy, hired on a flatboat at $8 a month, and had only a pair of breeches to my back, and they were buckskin. Now, if you know the nature of buckskin when wet and dried by the sun, you know it will shrink and my breeches kept on shrinking until they left several inches of my leg bare between the tops of my socks and the lower part of my breeches. And while I was growing taller, my breeches were becoming shorter, and so might tighter they left a little blue streak down my leg that can still be seen to this day. Now, if you call that being an aristocrat, I must plead guilty to the charge." End of quote. One night during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln was serenaded by a brass band, and as he stepped out into the dimly lit porch of the hotel to speak to the serenaders, one man held up a lantern so that the crowd could see Mr. Lincoln's homely face. Lincoln began by saying, quote, "My friends, the less you see of me, the better you will like me." End of quote. Lincoln knew the wisdom of the biblical advice, quote, "He that humbleth himself shall be exalted." End of quote. I was present at a convention of business school men in Chicago a few years ago, when each individual in the room was asked to stand up in turn and report what he had learned during the last year about operating a business school. Billy Wooton, formerly president of the Lockyer Business College of Evansville, Indiana, began his report by saying, quote, "I never had an original idea in my life, but I can copy pretty fast." End of quote. What happened? The audience laughed and admired Billy Wooton for his modesty and honesty. Winston Churchill, talking with General Eisenhower, put it this way, quote, "What I like about you, Ike, is that you ain't no glory hopper." End of quote. Ike demonstrated that he was no quote-unquote no glory hopper when he and his brother Milton, president-elect of Pennsylvania State College, were receiving an honorary degree from Temple University. Ike said, quote, "This is the first time I have been permitted to stand on the same platform with my brother to receive an honorary degree. In the opinion of the Eisenhower tribe, Dr. Milton is the only one of us fit to appear before an audience to make a public address. I myself have been told that I am an old brass hat with a brass-bound mind, and that I still look more at home in a blouse than a cap and a gown." End of quote. Churchill was right. Ike, quote-unquote, ain't no glory hopper. All of us can learn a lesson from old barefooted Socrates, one of the wisest persuaders of all time. Did he go around giving people an impression that he thought he was superior to them? No. He did the exact opposite. Like Lincoln, Churchill, and Eisenhower, he played himself down. He always represented himself as the dullest person in the crowd and, quote, disarmed ridicule by anticipating it. End of quote. He declared that to know that we know nothing is the beginning of wisdom. After studying many thousands of speakers, I have discovered that the secure, confident person never feels the need to impress people with his ability. It is the failure, the non-entity, who is impelled to force us to acknowledge him. Rule number 5. Let's say, quote-unquote, we instead of, quote-unquote, you. I have heard thousands of talks that were ineffective because the speaker gave the impression that he had a condescending attitude towards his listeners, and he did it by merely using the word, quote-unquote, you instead of, quote-unquote, we. For example, if I say, quote, when you are worried, you ought to get so busy that you won't have time to think about your troubles, end of quote. And if I keep on repeating, quote unquote, you, I give the impression that I'm lecturing you and talking down to you. Now, let's see whether it doesn't sound better this way, quote, when we are worried, we ought to get so busy that we won't have time to think about our troubles, end of quote. See the difference? When we use the words, quote unquote, you, we make ourselves offensive by seeming to take a superior attitude. Remember, the boss says, quote unquote, you. The leader says, quote unquote, we. Rule 6. Let's not talk with, quote unquote, a scowl face and an unbraided voice, end of quote. Let's remember that the expression on our face and the tone of our voice often speaks louder than our words. Socrates discovered that 400 years before Christ was born, he had an ardent and lifelong convocation that he had been ordained by God to improve both himself and those with whom he had come in contact. Yet he felt that this great and enduring mission could not be achieved without a, quote, a scowling face and an unbraided voice, end of quote. He had learned that from experience, right in his own home. He was married to a shrew. He knew that her scowling face and irritated tone bred only resentment in him, not cooperation. So let's remember that regardless of whether we are talking in private or public, we can't win friends with a scowling face and a scolding voice. Quintilian taught 19th century ago, quote, that which offends the ear will not easily gain admission to the mind, end of quote. And Quintilian might have added that which offends our ego will arouse nothing but anger and indignation. Rule 7. Let's talk in terms of our listeners' interests. All of our listeners are intensely and eternally interested in themselves and how to solve their problems. That is about all they are interested in. So, if we show them how to be happier, how to make more money, how to stop worrying, and how to get what they want, then they will listen to us gladly, regardless of what kind voice we have, or how we breathe, stand, look, gesture, or what kind of grammar we use. For example, several years ago I heard a sales manager talk about how he won friends and became more interesting conversationalists by merely asking people, quote, how did you get into your line of work, end of quote. He declared that simple question had worked wonders for him, especially with strangers. I have forgotten that speaker's name. I have forgotten what he looked like and how he spoke, but I never forgot what he said because he showed me how to solve one of my problems. Here is an example of how you can discuss almost any subject with an angle that will interest your listeners. When one of our Midwest representatives was invited to talk before the local traffic club, he decided to speak on a subject that he had been studying for 20 years, a subject that he had earned the right to talk about. Quote, advertising for profit, end of quote. Then he discovered that his audience would be composed almost entirely of owners and executives and of trucking and transportation companies, men who were not directly interested in the problem of advertising. However, after talking with several owners of trucking companies, he discovered that they were deeply concerned about their drop in tonnage due to the business recession. So he tied his subject up to their problems. He began like this, quote, "As an advertising executive, I find it reassuring to talk to a group of men whose prosperity is based just as directly on advertising as mine is. All of us must realize the power of advertising that starts the flow of goods from source to consumer, a flow through the railroads and truck lines that you men are operating. It is the spark of advertising that sets off the chain of events on which every man in the room relies for his bread and butter." End of quote. The speaker then talked about advertising for 30 minutes and made his audience like him by tying his subject to their interest. Rule 8. Let's have a good time making our talks. One of the most important principles of speaking, a principle that no one ever told me about, one that I had to learn the hard way, is this: the tremendous importance of having a good time making our talks. If we don't enjoy speaking, how can we even hope that anyone would enjoy listening? I have learned that lesson as a result of giving hundreds of talks over the United States, Canada, and the British Isles. On one occasion, at least, I talked to an audience in Baltimore where I was so exhausted that I held on to the edge of the table to keep from falling to the floor, and yet I don't believe that my listeners knew that I was exhausted. Why? Because I was so excited about my material, so eager to communicate it to the audience, that I couldn't keep from speaking with energy and excitement. No matter what our mental and emotional attitudes are, they are bound to be contagious. If we are having a good time speaking, singing, or skating, the people who are watching us or listening to us are also bound to have a good time. Emotional attitudes are as contagious as measles. That goes not only for speaking, it also goes for singing, dancing, playing the piano, acting, marriage, selling, writing, or advertising. Quote, but, you ask, how can I have a rip-roaring good time making a talk? End of quote. The secret is simple. Talk about something you have earned the right to talk about. Something that puts a sparkle in your eye and you feel it in your voice. For example, if I talked about the tariff, I would bore everyone, including myself. But when I talk about, quote, how to win friends and how to stop worrying, or the magic of enthusiasm, end of quote, I always have a good time and hope that some of my listeners do too. It is not necessary for a speaker to have a serious or a weighty message in order to win the goodwill of an audience. One of the most charming talks I have ever heard from a member in these classes was made by a housewife in Chicago on the subject of back doors. A class member in Tulsa, Oklahoma, gave a memorable 2-minute talk on bean soup. All of us like to relax and have fun occasionally. A talk doesn't have to deal with an important issue to be good. For example, not long ago, Miss Carnegie returned from a trip to Washington, D.C., where she visited one of our classes. In telling me about the talks she had heard there, she seemed particularly interested by a talk given by Earl B. Fuller. Quote, what did Mr. Fuller talk about? End of quote. I asked. Quote, "He talked about raising tropical fish," end quote, she told me. Quote unquote, "Well," I replied, quote, "I didn't know we were interested in tropical fish," end quote. "I wasn't," said my wife, quote, "until Mr. Fuller started to talk. But he was so excited about tropical fish himself that he got me excited too," end quote. Mr. Fuller had evidently learned his fundamental lesson in winning audiences. He knew how to have a good time making a talk. Rule 9. Let's not apologize. Haven't you heard speakers begin by saying something like, I didn't know I was supposed to give this talk until 2 weeks from the chairman told me I would have to fill in for the president. Well, I mean, to give some time to it, but I had to make a trip to the coast coming back. I caught a bad cold on the train, so I'm afraid I won't be able to do much of a job today. I'm not much of a speaker of any time, but, quote, the audience is fidgety and bored with his preamble and wondering why he doesn't either get down to business or shut up. No one should ever accept an invitation to speak unless he is able to give it the necessary preparation. If he does the best he can do, no apologies are required. If he doesn't, no amount of apologies will be acceptable. Apologies are usually an irritating waste of an audience's time. If a speaker is so troubled by a cold or any other physical disability that he cannot make himself heard, or if he has to stop talking and cough or blow his nose frequently, he is justified in canceling his talk because of his illness. Out of consideration for the audience, he should do so. But it is necessary to apologize to an audience for a slight hoarseness or any other minor ailment that doesn't entirely prevent us from making a talk. The audience is interested in what we have to say, not the state of our health. However, if we are unavoidably late in making a speaking engagement due to being a grounded plane, a late train, or some equally valid reason, we should explain the circumstances briefly, apologize courteously, and then get on to the talk before any more time is lost. Generally speaking, excuses and apologies are time wasters and annoying. They make a speaker seem insecure and unsure of himself, miserable and inexperienced, which he probably is. People take us pretty much at face value. If we do our honest best and ignore our faults and shortcomings, our audiences will usually do the same. Do you remember reading the grand old classic of your childhood, Alice in Wonderland? If so, you will recall that the Mad Hatter, when he testified in court before the King of Hearts, clasped his hands and fell on his knees in the agony of embarrassment, saying, quote, "I am a poor man, Your Majesty. I am a poor man. I am a poor man." End quote. Quote, "You're a very poor speaker at any rate." End quote, snapped the king. And that is the way most of us feel towards a speaker who showers us with apologies. Rule 10. Let's appeal to the nobler emotions of our audience. I once heard Louis E. Neferi of New York City, who was enrolled in one of our classes, hold an audience spellbound with a simple talk that vibrated with feeling and emotion. quote, 3 years ago, end quote, he said, quote, our doctor told me that my father had but a week to live. From then on, I spent all of my time with him at the hospital. Strangely enough, my father did most of the talking. One day he suddenly said to me, quote, Lou, why didn't you ever invite me to any of your commencement exercises in school? End quote. I was taken aback and answered weakly that the school commencements were meaningless and a waste of time. Quote, my father then told me that once when he was working on a Fordham University, he had seen one of the commencement exercises and he had looked forward with great longing to see his own son in cap and gown. I was ashamed of myself. I had never dreamed that seeing me graduate from college would mean that much to him. Quote, he asked me why I had studied engineering instead of medicine. He asked me whether I had played football in college. He asked me many other questions about my undergraduate days. Then, and only then, did I realize that he had always wanted to confide in him and let him be not only my father but also my friend. I could hardly hold back the tears. I realized, when it was too late, that I had rebuffed my father every time he had shown any interest in me. I hadn't meant to. I just hadn't understood. Quote, at his bedside I realized at last how kind he had been to me and how tolerant and how much he loved me. I realized, too late, that I had lost an opportunity to make a friend and a pal in my father. When I realized the invitation to attend the graduation exercise of my class tonight, I wished, oh, how I had wished that my father could come with me. It's too late now, but perhaps he is here tonight in spirit. If we do have any unseen guests tonight, I want you and them to know that I invited him. End of quote. The audience loved that talk. It woke in all of us feelings of tenderness and love for our parents. It made all of us want to be better sons and daughters. It enlarged our insights and gave us more understanding of both fathers and sons. Everybody in that audience was a better human being for having heard that moving, sincere, simple little story. And we loved Louis Neferi because he touched the spring of love and kindness that lie deep in all of us. The world may seem to be in pretty bad shape, but our hearts still respond to the great human emotion of courage, love, kindness, patriotism, and unselfish sacrifice. Whoever touches those noble emotions in us does a rare and wonderful thing, because whether we realize it or not, these are the faiths we live by and on which we base our hopes. The Napoleons and the Hitlers have their hour and die, but become mere names with the passing of years. But the Joan of Arcs will be living inspirations to each succeeding generation till the end of time. To inspire an audience by stirring these great emotions is not easy. We must first be deeply stirred ourselves, and when we are not able or often stirred that deeply, but once that spark of noble emotion is lit and the flame plays over speaker and audience alike, the warm glow of this experience will be long remembered. Rule 11. Let's welcome criticism instead of resenting it. Probably no other scientist ever lived was criticized and denounced by outrageousness as Charles Darwin for his theories of evolution. Yet he never uttered a harsh word against any of his critics. Instead, he thanked them, saying that the primary purpose of his life was to uncover knowledge and discover truth. And when searching for the truth, two minds were better than one. Quote, "If I am wrong," end quote, he said, quote, "the sooner I am knocked on the head and annihilated, so much the better." End quote. How can we keep from admiring and respecting and even loving a man with that attitude? 1700 years before Darwin, Epictetus was preaching a similar philosophy. Quote, "If a man is reported to have spoken ill of you," end quote, said Epictetus, quote, "make no defense, but say, he did not know the rest of my faults, else he would have mentioned only these." End quote. Reverend Johnson, a colored preacher in the Mason County, Georgia, never heard of Epictetus, but he applies his philosophy. Reverend Johnson learned one Sunday that a group of 5 men from the speech department of Fort Valley State College were coming to listen to him preach, to record his sermon, and to make notes on his gestures, his methods of preaching, and the reaction of his listeners. Even a graduate of the Yale Divinity School might have felt a trifle nervous under such conditions, but not the Reverend Johnson. No, sir, not he. He opened his sermon by saying in a good-natured way, quote, "Some people done come here looking for mistakes. Well, dat feller," meaning the professional speaker professors, "ain't gwine be disappointed, 'cause I's full of dem." End quote. And the audience laughed. The speech professor laughed. Everyone was amused, and the old colored preacher demonstrated that he knew how to make his listeners like him. In 1941, Lord Halifax, the British ambassador in the United States, was doing all in his power to persuade America to join Great Britain in her war against Hitler. Many mothers resented his entreaties. So, on one occasion, after Lord Halifax had finished his speech, a group of indignant women spat on him with eggs. Lord Halifax looked down upon the spattered eggs dripping from his clothes and merely remarked, wryly, quote, "In England, they're so scarce," end quote. How could you help admiring a man who took criticism and eggs so graciously? Rule 12. Let's be the quintillion called, quote, "a good man skilled in speaking," end quote. Aristotle says that a, quote, "speaker's character may almost be called the most effective means of persuasion he possesses," end quote. My father was a living example of Aristotle's statement. Father lived on Missouri farms all his life. He had little schooling, no knowledge of history or literature, no fluency with words. He was more at home in the cornfield or cow barn than before any audience. If anyone had told me when I was studying public speaking in college that my father was even a fair speaker, I would have laughed at the idea. But now, after the passing of many years, I realize that when my father stood up to say a few words in some county church, he was unusually effective. Why? because he breathed and lived sincerity, integrity, unselfishness, and the desire to help others. Quintilian would be admired, for Quintilian defined as an orator as, quote, a good man skilled in speaking, end quote. All the eloquence in the world will not make up for the lack of sincerity and integrity. To make an audience like us, we must inspire them with confidence in our honest of our purpose. They may not agree with our ideas, but they must respect our belief in those ideas if we are to be effective. When we are speaking more loudly than what we say, sincerity, integrity, modesty, and unselfishness affect an audience deeply. A political club in Tulsa, Oklahoma, invited a known manufacturer to speak to its members. When this man faced the audience, he said that he had never spoken before in public, that he had been an orphan, and that he had only a few years of formal schooling. He said he spoke ungrammatically and roughly. He had accepted the invitation to speak because he had something to say that would not stay unsaid, something he felt was very deeply important. Then this man told the group about his orphan childhood, his tremendous struggle against heavy odds, his long fight to build up a business, and he told how the government administration was affecting the business and affecting his hundreds of employees. His English was crude and faulty. His manners were not refined, but this uneducated man who had pulled himself up by his bootstraps spoke with a passion, burning sincerity that electrified his hearers. This man had worked and toiled and suffered. He had a message that he was eager to give. When he told his life, it was like the voice of America speaking. His inner convictions were so strong that they made his outer faults insignificant and his talk unforgettable. I was told that he was the first speaker that the club ever had, yet he had never addressed an audience before in his life. But he was, like my father, a good man speaking, and the audience was as much affected by that he was as by what he said. We much prefer a clumsy speaker who radiates honesty and unselfishness to a polished orator who is trying to impress us with his eloquence. In a nutshell, 12 ways to make our listeners like us. 1. If we feel that we are honored by being addressed or asked to address an audience, let's say so. Rule 2. Let's give our listeners some appreciation. Rule 3. Whenever possible, let's mention the names of some of our listeners. Rule 4. Let's play ourselves down, not up. Rule 5. Let's say we instead of you. Rule 6. Let's not talk with a scowling face and upbraiding voice. Rule 7. Let's talk in terms of our listeners' interests. Rule 8. Let's have a good time making our talks. Rule 9. Let's not apologize. Rule 10. Let's appeal to the nobler emotions of our audience. Rule 11. Let's welcome criticism instead of resenting it. And Rule 12. Let's be what Quintilian called quote, a good man skilled in speaking, end of quote. And thus concludes this little pamphleture of How to Make Our Listeners Like Us by Dale Carnegie.